The sky above Moscow glowed with an eerie and terrifying orange light on a crisp September night in the year 1812. Huge plumes of dark smoke billowed upward to choke the stars as the wooden buildings of the ancient capital were consumed by voracious flames. Napoleon Bonaparte stood on the ramparts of the Kremlin and watched in disbelief as the city he had just conquered turned into a blazing inferno around him. He had expected a formal surrender from the Russian Tsar, but instead he found a ghost town that was rapidly burning to the ground. The heat was so intense that it could be felt through the thick stone walls of the fortress, while ash fell like gray snow upon the shoulders of his bewildered French soldiers. This was not merely a tragic accident of war or the result of a stray ember igniting a dry roof in the autumn wind. It was a deliberate and calculated act of destruction, orchestrated to deny the invading Grand Army the food and shelter they desperately needed to survive the coming winter. The stakes could not have been higher for the Russian Empire, as the very existence of the nation hung in the balance against the greatest military mind of the era. If Napoleon could sustain his massive army in Moscow through the winter, the heart of Russia would be lost forever. The decision to burn their own holy city was a gamble of unprecedented magnitude, involving the sacrifice of immense wealth and history to save the future. At the center of this grim strategy stood Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov, a heavy-set and battle-scarred veteran who understood the brutal arithmetic of survival better than anyone else. With one eye lost to a previous war and a body weary from decades of service, Kutuzov possessed a patience that infuriated his younger and more aggressive subordinates. He knew that he could not defeat Napoleon in a direct contest of tactical maneuvering on an open field, for the French emperor was a genius of movement and artillery. Instead, Kutuzov chose to weaponize the vast and unforgiving geography of Russia itself, turning the land into a weapon that would slowly bleed the enemy dry. The question that haunted the Russian high command and the terrified civilians fleeing the city was whether such a horrific sacrifice could actually yield a victory. Could the destruction of one's own resources and the abandonment of the spiritual capital really be enough to break the will of a conqueror who had brought all of Europe to its knees? The strategy of scorched earth required a resolve that went against every human instinct to protect one's home and property. It demanded that the defenders become the destroyers and that the people suffer immediate devastation to prevent a permanent conquest. The world watched to see if this desperate gamble would result in salvation or total ruin. The answer came not in a single day, but over the agonizing weeks that followed the Great Fire of Moscow. Napoleon found himself master of a charred ruin with no supplies to feed his starving troops and no political surrender from the Tsar. As the first snowflakes of the Russian winter began to fall, the French emperor was forced to order a retreat that would become one of the greatest catastrophes in military history. The scorched earth policy had worked by transforming a tactical victory for the French into a strategic death trap. The Grand Army would be decimated not by muskets and cannons alone, but by the freezing void left behind by a resource denied. This brutal tactic, known as scorched earth, has echoed throughout history as the ultimate resort of a defender willing to pay any price for survival. It is a strategy that targets the logistics and stomach of an enemy rather than their front-line soldiers. From the ancient plains of Gaul to the humid swamps of the American South and the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front, commanders have burned bridges and poisoned wells to halt advancing armies. It is a concept that strips war of its glory and reveals the grim reality that victory often belongs to those who can endure the most suffering. The history of this policy is written in ash and hunger. Long before Kutuzov faced Napoleon, the ancient Gauls employed similar tactics against the legions of Julius Caesar. In the 1st century before the Common Era, the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix realized that he could not match the discipline of the Roman heavy infantry in open battle. He ordered his people to burn their own farms and granaries to prevent the Romans from foraging for food in the countryside. This decision caused immense hardship for the Gallic tribes who watched their harvest go up in smoke, but it also brought the Roman war machine to a grinding halt. Caesar himself wrote of the difficulty in securing grain and the constant threat of starvation that plagued his legions. The logic behind scorched earth is rooted in the fundamental truth that armies march on their stomachs. A soldier requires thousands of calories a day to march and fight, while horses need vast quantities of fodder to pull wagons and carry cavalrymen. If an invading force cannot transport enough supplies from their homeland, they must forage from the territory they occupy. By systematically destroying food stocks and shelter, a defender forces the invader to stretch their supply lines until they snap. It turns the environment into a hostile wasteland where every mile gained comes with a heavy cost in logistics and morale. During the 100 Years' War, the English employed a variation of this tactic known as the chevauchée against the French population. While not strictly a defensive scorched earth policy, the chevauchée involved fast-moving raids that burned villages and destroyed crops to undermine the economic base of the enemy. The goal was to prove that the French king could not protect his subjects and to draw his forces into a disadvantageous battle. Smoke rose from the fields of France for generations as a testament to the effectiveness of targeting resources. These raids demonstrated that destroying the means of production was as effective as destroying an army. In the 15th century, the infamous Vlad the Impaler used scorched earth tactics to defend Wallachia against the overwhelming might of the Ottoman Empire. Facing the massive army of Sultan Mehmed II, Vlad ordered the evacuation of civilians and the poisoning of wells along the Ottoman line of advance. He burned crops and drove livestock deep into the Carpathian Mountains, leaving nothing for the Turks but disease and hunger. When the Ottoman army approached the capital of Targovist, they found a forest of impaled bodies and a land devoid of life. The psychological and physical toll forced the Sultan to withdraw despite his superior numbers. The Peninsular War in the early 19th century saw another masterclass in defensive destruction under the command of the Duke of Wellington. To protect the Portuguese capital of Lisbon, Wellington constructed the massive lines of Torres Vedras, which were a series of fortifications stretching from the river to the sea. But fortifications alone were not enough to stop the French Marshal Massena. Wellington ordered the complete devastation of the countryside in front of the lines, compelling the Portuguese people to destroy their own food and flee their homes. It was a harsh decree that caused great suffering, but it ultimately starved the French army into retreat. Returning to the Russian campaign of 1812, the implementation of the policy required absolute ruthlessness from the Russian leadership. General Barclay de Tolly, who commanded the Russian forces before Kutuzov, initiated the retreat that drew Napoleon deeper into the void. He was widely criticized by his fellow officers for refusing to stand and fight, but he understood that preserving the army was more important than preserving territory. Every mile the French marched took them further from their supply bases in Poland and Germany. The roads became graveyards for horses that died of exhaustion and lack of fodder. When Kutuzov took command, he continued the retreat despite the political pressure to save Moscow. He fought a bloody battle at Borodino to inflict damage on the French, but he refused to commit his reserves to a suicidal last stand. The decision to abandon Moscow without a second battle was one of the most difficult choices in Russian history. Kutuzov famously stated that the loss of Moscow did not mean the loss of Russia, but the loss of the army would mean the end of everything. He withdrew his forces south of the city and waited for the inevitable collapse of the French logistics. The retreat of Napoleon from Moscow is a harrowing tale of an army disintegrating under the weight of the scorched earth strategy. As the French marched back along the same road they had used to invade, they found a wasteland where every village had already been stripped bare. There was no food to be found, and the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep or fought over the carcass of a horse for a scrap of meat. The scorched earth had done its work perfectly by turning the Russian winter into an executioner for the starving invaders. Half a world away and 50 years later, the scorched earth policy would be applied with devastating efficiency during the American Civil War. The Union General William Tecumseh Sherman believed that the war could only be ended by breaking the spirit of the Confederate population. He argued that the South derived its strength not just from its armies, but from the material support of its people. Sherman proposed a campaign that would cut a swath of destruction through the heart of Georgia, destroying the resources that fed the Confederate war effort. Sherman was a complex figure who famously declared that war is hell and that he intended to make it so terrible that the South would never want to fight again. He was not interested in the traditional rules of engagement that protected private property. In November 1864, he severed his own supply lines and marched his army from Atlanta to the coastal city of Savannah. This campaign became known as the March to the Sea. His orders were explicit regarding the destruction of mills, houses, cotton gins, and railroads. The Union troops spread out across a front 60 miles wide, foraging liberally on the country. They seized livestock and crops, leaving the inhabitants with barely enough to survive the winter. Groups of soldiers known as bummers acted as authorized foragers who scoured every plantation and farm for hidden supplies. They poked the ground with ramrods to find buried valuables and food stores. The path of the army was marked by the smoke of burning barns and the twisted metal of destroyed railroads. One of the most effective techniques used by Sherman was the destruction of the railway infrastructure, which was vital for the movement of Confederate troops and supplies. Soldiers would tear up the tracks and heat the iron rails over bonfires made from the wooden ties. Once the iron was red hot, they would twist the rails around trees, creating what were known as Sherman's neckties. These twisted rails could not be repaired and had to be sent to a rolling mill to be reformed, effectively crippling the transport network of the South. The psychological impact of the March to the Sea was just as significant as the physical destruction. For the Southern population, the sight of the Union Army marching unopposed through their heartland was a crushing blow to their morale. It demonstrated that the Confederate government could no longer protect its citizens. Sherman wrote to President Lincoln that he had destroyed over $100 million worth of property and that much of it was simple waste and destruction. The scorched earth policy hastened the end of the war by proving the futility of continued resistance. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the British Empire utilized scorched earth tactics during the Second Boer War in South Africa. Facing a highly mobile guerrilla force of Boer commandos, the British commander Lord Kitchener struggled to bring the enemy to a decisive battle. The Boers relied on support from local farmsteads to sustain their hit-and-run attacks. To counter this, Kitchener ordered the systematic burning of Boer farms and the destruction of livestock to deny the commandos their base of support. The British columns swept through the veldt, torching thousands of farmhouses and slaughtering herds of sheep and cattle. The women and children who were displaced by this policy were rounded up and placed in concentration camps, where poor hygiene and disease led to appalling mortality rates. The policy was militarily effective in restricting the movement of the Boer commandos, but it caused a humanitarian outrage in Britain and around the world. It showed the dark side of scorched earth, where civilians bear the brunt of total war. The scale of scorched earth tactics reached a terrifying new level during the Second World War on the Eastern Front. In 1941, as the German Wehrmacht smashed through the Soviet defenses, Joseph Stalin issued a directive that mirrored the strategy of 1812. He ordered that not a single railway engine, a single wagon, a single pound of grain, or a gallon of fuel should be left for the enemy. The Soviet people were instructed to destroy everything of value before retreating eastward. This was total war in its most absolute form, involving the destruction of industrial infrastructure that had taken decades to build. Factories in the Western Soviet Union were dismantled brick by brick and shipped to the Ural Mountains to be reassembled beyond the range of German bombers. What could not be moved was blown up or burned. The famous Dnieper hydroelectric station, which was the pride of Soviet industrialization, was dynamited by retreating Red Army troops to prevent the Germans from using its power. The destruction of the Dnieper Dam sent a massive wall of water surging downstream, flooding villages and killing both soldiers and civilians. It was a testament to the desperate resolve of the Soviet leadership to deny the enemy any advantage. The Germans found themselves advancing into a ruined land where bridges were blown and railway gauges were incompatible. They had to rebuild the entire infrastructure of the occupied territories while fighting a high-intensity war, which put an immense strain on their logistics. As the tide of the war turned and the Red Army began to push the Germans back in 1943, the Nazis implemented their own scorched earth policy. German commanders ordered the systematic destruction of cities and villages as they retreated toward the Reich. They used special machines to tear up railroad ties and sowed millions of mines to slow the Soviet advance. The territory between the Volga and the Elbe became a wasteland of ruined cities and burning horizons. In the northern theater of the war, the Finnish army employed scorched earth tactics during the Winter War against the Soviet Union. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Finns used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They burned farmhouses and shelters in the path of the advancing Soviet divisions, forcing the invaders to sleep in the open during the freezing Arctic winter. The Finns targeted field kitchens and supply columns, ensuring that the Soviet troops were cold, hungry, and demoralized. The Sino-Japanese War also witnessed the catastrophic application of scorched earth tactics. In 1938, the Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek ordered the destruction of the dikes holding back the Yellow River to stop the Japanese advance. The resulting flood created a massive barrier of water and mud that halted the Japanese army, but it came at a horrific cost. The floodwaters inundated thousands of villages and drowned hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians in one of the deadliest acts of environmental warfare in history. The legacy of scorched earth continued into the modern era during the Persian Gulf War in 1991. As Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait, they set fire to over 600 oil wells, turning the desert day into night. The sky was blackened by thick oily smoke that could be seen from space, and the ground was coated in crude oil. This act of sabotage was intended to destroy the economic infrastructure of Kuwait, but it resulted in an ecological disaster of massive proportions. The fires in Kuwait burned for months, requiring a global effort of firefighters to extinguish them. The intent was purely punitive, as the destruction of the oil wells offered no military advantage to the retreating Iraqi army. It was a scorched earth policy driven by spite and a desire to leave nothing behind but ruin. This event highlighted the environmental dimension of resource denial, where the damage inflicted on the natural world can last for decades after the peace treaty is signed. Reflecting on these historical examples reveals the terrible ethical calculus of the scorched earth policy. It is a strategy that deliberately blurs the line between combatant and non-combatant, targeting the very means of human survival. While it has proven effective in halting invaders and winning wars, it leaves deep scars on the land and the people. The rebuilding process after a scorched earth campaign can take generations, as the fundamental infrastructure of society must be reconstructed from the ground up. The effectiveness of the policy relies on the assumption that the defender has more will to endure suffering than the attacker has the will to conquer. It is a test of pain tolerance on a national scale. In the case of Russia in 1812 and 1941, the strategy worked because the population was willing to accept the destruction of their homes to save their nation. In other cases, such as the Boer War, the tactic bred resentment and hatred that fueled future conflicts. The legal status of scorched earth has evolved over time, with modern international law placing strict limits on the destruction of civilian property. The Geneva Conventions prohibit the destruction of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as foodstuffs, agricultural areas, and drinking water installations. However, the line between military necessity and wanton destruction remains a subject of debate in military tribunals and strategic planning rooms around the world. The story of scorched earth is not just a story of generals and maps, but of the millions of ordinary people who watched their livelihoods vanish in flames. It is the story of the farmer who burns his own barn, the engineer who blows up the bridge he built, and the family that walks away from their home knowing they will never see it again. These individual tragedies accumulate to form the strategic picture of denial that has shaped the outcome of empires. From the burning of Moscow to the twisted rails of Georgia, the message remains the same. If you want this land, you will inherit nothing but ash and dust. The scorched earth policy is the ultimate expression of total defense, a declaration that freedom is worth more than property. It is a terrifying reminder of the lengths to which humanity will go when pushed to the brink of extinction. As we look back on the smoke-filled horizons of the past, we are reminded of the fragility of civilization. The cities and fields we build can be unmade in an instant by the torch of war. The scorched earth policy stands as a grim monument to the destructive power of human conflict, where the earth itself is held hostage in the struggle for victory. It teaches us that sometimes the only way to save a nation is to destroy it first.